fear of disconnection from our trusted others or circle of friends, family, work relationship, etc. It is the fear that something we have done or failed to do makes us unworthy of the connections with our circle of influence. Shame becomes a problem when this poison is released inwardly and results with us becoming our worst critic and scrutinizer of our own selves. Shame is a psychological toxin because instead of people feeling bad about their actions, which are guilt, or their efforts, regret, shame makes a person feel bad about who they are. Now, this is a side note. Martha Stout, she's the author of The Paranoia Switch. She says, a terrorist attack is unsuccessful unless it affects the mind. The most successful attacks, regardless of how much physical damage is done or it fails to do, is one that affects our minds most deeply and continues to affect them long after the knife edges of grief have dulled a little and demolished structures have been rebuilt and the catastrophe itself has begun or has become history. Shame goes to the core of our ego, our identity, our self-esteem, our feelings of well-being. The damaging nature of shame triggers learned unconscious behaviors for those who have the fear of failure to mitigate the implications of the future failures. Shame is the first negative bias that we learn in our culture. In the Christian tradition, with Adam and Eve, when they have disobeyed the command of their God, they cover themselves with leaves and hide their nakedness from each other. Not because they were afraid, but because they were ashamed. As the story goes on, Adam and Eve hid from their God. They are asked why they are hiding from the God, and the man replies that they were ashamed of their state of nakedness. When asked by God who informed them of this nakedness, the blame game began and it has continued ever since. Our first lesson in our lives is the negative bias that comes from our culture is to be ashamed of our nakedness, our natural state of beingness. The truth of the matter is, no matter how deeply we feel ashamed, most of the time it has little to do with our sense of worth or even the wrongdoing that we've done. Let's talk about the causes of shame. Cultural norms. In many cultures or societies, certain sexual interactions such as homosexuality or sex between unmarried people are looked down upon. People who transgress these cultural norms may feel shame. In the collective culture, these are cultures where the emphasis or the needs and the goals of the group are focused on the whole as opposed to the desires of each individual person. Some people experience shame when loved ones violate cultural moral norms. Researchers find that the cause of shame aligned with the cultural norms of different countries. For example, eating with the left hand is considered shameful in India, and therefore people there are conditioned, presumably by a sense of shame, to eat only with their right hand. Shame is considered a trait that is associated mainly with costs, such as being shunned by peers and the devaluation by society rather than benefits. Some people would suggest that shame is much like a pain. It keeps people from making poor decisions in the first place. But shame works as a buffer in the internal man, as a buffer from social backlash. Shame is not a basic emotion such as disgust or joy, which are hardwired into our body and brain. Shame is a social emotion that depends on an awareness of social relationship before it occurs. Now, it's impossible for a new baby to experience shame because a newborn has no concept of the social world around him. There is just the baby's needs, and that's pretty much it. Only through gradual interaction, frustration, and slow emotional development does a baby eventually realize that it is a separate being from others. It is only after this realization of self as a part of the web of social relationship that shame occurs. Self-esteem issues. Most people derive a large sense of their self-esteem and identity through their relationship with other people. Even if those relationships are not intimate, even if they are contentious or jealous in nature, so long as people look up to others and need them in some emotional fashion, it would be hard for them not to take seriously what other people have to say about them. People with low self-esteem because of certain attachment styles may struggle with feelings of shame or embarrassment. We can therefore also agree that what holds us back from being in this more empowered state of high self-esteem is low self-esteem, where we feel unworthy, doubts our abilities, and lack the assertiveness to hold the boundaries. Low self-esteem is propelled by shame, and shame often appears as a small voice in the back of our minds which tells us we are unworthy, we're not slim enough, rich enough, smart enough, good looking enough, or simply not enough. Shame is what keeps our self-esteem low and stops us from daring to be more. We all have our own unique stories around shame. It is often the case that we build our belief system from our early experiences or key life experiences. Children can be shamed from being too loud, boisterous, when they are first learning about the curiosity and about play. If shame sets in at an early age, it affects them in later life that they might forego the qualities which could otherwise develop into assertiveness, creativity, and innovation. There's also a shame about not having the latest gadget, which induces shame around poverty. Shame also affects us differently based on gender. Women are expected to look a certain way, as are men. Men are ambushed from being vulnerable, which prevents them from seeking mental health care despite them having high suicide rate. And women are shamed for being too emotional and hormonal. We are shamed around our sex lives as heterosexuals, and perhaps even our sexuality as the LGBTQ community. We all have our own stigmas of shame attached to us. Each story of shame affects our self-worth and tells us we are not fine as we are. When we start to translate the shame into our later lives, we see how we may start to avoid shame. We might try to numb our shame, sometimes with food, addictions, seeing as there is an obesity, addiction, and debt and violence crisis, certainly in most first world societies. All issues which are psychologically related to shame. Alternatively, we try to protect ourselves to meet the ideal we feel that we need to so that we can stay as far away from shame as possible. We may do this through correcting what shames us, going through procedures where we inject the fat from our butts into our cheeks and lips, or we get fake tans to cover cellulite and stretch marks. We might try to buy things we cannot afford or show a face of confidence to the world to avoid deep-seated discomfort we have with ourselves. These are just some of the ways we keep our low esteem at bay by trying to manufacture what looks like high esteem but only turns out to fuel our shame. 1, 2, 3, testing. 1, 2, 3, testing. Religious conditioning. Shaming is an attempt to make another person feel the shame. Shaming targets who a person is, not what they do. Telling a child that they're bad is an act of shaming. Shaming also sometimes appeals to religious or social norms. Publicly airing a person's misdeed is usually an attempt to shame them. Some religious institutions weaponize scriptures and religion to do very deep damage on the psyche. Gay, lesbian, and trans people are told that God condemns them, the unwed mother, that they are living in sin, and many natural human desires are deemed evil. Scientific research into the consequences of such religious condemnation remains still at an early stage, but the potential for harm is clear. Many suffer for decades from post-traumatic syndrome disorder type symptoms, including anxiety, self-doubt, or feeling of social inadequacy. There is a term for this, religious trauma syndrome. Now, you won't find this condition in the diagnostic and statistical manuals of mental disorders, which clinicians use to make their diagnosis. But this term has been gaining currency with the psychotherapists, counselors, and others who do work with people who are recovering from the harmful effects of religious indoctrination. Shame strategies are widely used to influence people on every level of the culture, including religion, shopping, and politics. Consider the case of the original sin for a moment. Religion, which affirms the doctrine of original sin, suggests that people are corrupt by nature, a condition which can only be made right through wholehearted, uncritical acceptance and active practices of that religion itself. This practice would be innocent enough if it was done purely as a teaching mode, in the way that's similar to how parents end up shaming their child as a method of socializing them. But some religious leaders use this process of religious shaming to enrich themselves or project and amplify their political views by swaying them, saying that God spoke to them when they endorse one candidate or one policy over another. Control is one of the most common reasons for self-sabotage, because in these people, there is a need for control. If you have past traumas stemming from a situation that you are unable to control, you may well have developed a coping mechanism in you which tries to control every situation you're in. Being in control helps you feel safe and secure, as opposed to the feeling vulnerable and weak as you did in the past. A sense of shame is one of the most toxic emotions we can experience. Modern medical understanding of addiction and compulsivity tells us that we are driven and are often wanting to escape from or compensate for a profound sense of shame and inadequacy. Shame centers on your very identity as a person. It becomes particularly toxic when it starts to impact your sense of self. Toxic shame opens the door to anger, self-disgust, and other less than desirable feelings. It can make you feel small and worthless. It can trickle into your inner dialogue like poison, locking you into a painful loop of negative self-talk. People shame one another because shaming is effective, and it's an effective way of gaining power over others, altering and shaping their behavior. Shame communicates who is the outcast and who is the elite, who is one up and who is one down. Most people can't help but care a lot about their relative social standing. They derive a whole lot of their own self-esteem from how other people treat them. And if other people start treating them badly or otherwise communicating outsider status, they will start to question their own self-worth. Abusive people communicate through their abuse that they are using you like an object for their own pleasure, and they put strong pressure on you to start thinking of yourself as an object, a punching bag, a slut, an object of ridicule, a nothing. The more you buy into the proposition that you are an object for others to take advantage of, the more easy it becomes for those abusive people to take further advantage of you, because you start cooperating with them taking advantage of you.